My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and the day my father tried to humiliate me in court was the day his entire world started falling apart. My daughter can't even afford a lawyer. Harold Whitmore sneered loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. I stood alone beside a folding table with a stack of papers held together by a rubber band I'd found in the junk drawer at home. Across from me sat 3 attorneys in expensive suits beside my father and my older brother Daniel. Their polished leather briefcases probably cost more than my car. I could feel every eye in that Indianapolis courtroom sliding toward me with pity. Or worse, judgment. Then Judge Raymond Keller adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my father. "She's all she needs." The room went quiet. I remember the exact sound that followed. A chair creaking somewhere behind me. Someone coughing softly near the back wall. Even the air conditioner seemed louder suddenly. Judge Keller leaned back slowly, still staring at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I believe we've met before." "Yes, Your Honor." Harold's attorney frowned. "You know the defendant." The judge folded his hands calmly. "Mrs. Whitmore served on a financial fraud jury in my courtroom 6 years ago. She identified discrepancies in accounting records that trained auditors overlooked." I heard Daniel whisper, "What?" The judge continued. "And from what I understand, she has elected to represent herself today." Harold's lawyer glanced at me again, only this time he wasn't smiling anymore. Neither was my father. That was the moment the ground shifted beneath all of them. But to explain how a 45-year-old diner waitress ended up standing alone against the most powerful man in our family, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back before my mother died. Back before my father decided I no longer deserved to be called his daughter. I've lived in Indianapolis my whole life. Not the polished parts tourists see around Monument Circle during Christmas. I'm talking about the real Indianapolis. The neighborhoods with cracked sidewalks, old churches, family diners, and people who still wave from their porches in the evening. For the last 12 years, I worked breakfast shifts at Grady's Family Diner on the West Side. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills most months if I stretched things carefully. I raised my daughter Lucy there. Well, not inside the diner exactly, though some days it felt like it. Lucy used to sit in booth 7 after school doing homework while I poured coffee for truck drivers and retirees. The older regulars practically watched her grow up. She's 17 now, smart as a whip, better than me in almost every way. Her father left when she was 9. Tom couldn't handle debt collectors' long work hours or responsibility. One day, he packed a duffel bag and said he needed space. I later found out Space was a woman in Louisville, 20 years younger than him. After that, it was just me and Lucy. And my mother, Patricia Whitmore, was the only reason I stayed connected to the Whitmore family at all. Harold Whitmore built commercial real estate across Indiana, office buildings, shopping centers, apartment developments. He loved newspaper articles with his picture in them almost as much as he loved hearing himself talk. To the outside world, my father was respected. At home, respect was something he demanded, not something he earned. Especially from me. Daniel worked for my father's company from the day he graduated college. He wore expensive suits, played golf with investors, and laughed at all the right moments during business dinners. I poured coffee for construction workers at 6 in the morning. That difference embarrassed my father more than he ever admitted out loud. But my mother never cared. When she got sick 3 years ago, everything changed. It started with fatigue, then dizziness, then doctors, endless doctors. By the time they diagnosed congestive heart failure, she needed regular assistance almost daily. Daniel always claimed he was too busy. My father hired nurses occasionally, but he hated spending money on long-term care. So I became the one who drove her to appointments. I organized medications. I sat beside hospital beds overnight, while machines beeped softly in dark rooms that smelled like antiseptic and loneliness. Sometimes Mom would squeeze my hand and whisper, "You were always the strongest one, Ellie." I never believed her. Not then. One winter night, after a terrible snowstorm, I drove 40 minutes across icy roads because my father refused to take her to the emergency room himself. "She's overreacting," he'd snapped over the phone. She wasn't. Her oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low. I sat beside her hospital bed until sunrise, while my father slept comfortably in his gated neighborhood on the north side. That was the pattern for years. Me showing up, them making excuses. Then came the funeral. I still can't think about that day without feeling cold inside. The service was held at a large church downtown, filled with businessmen, politicians, and people who barely knew my mother beyond country club conversations. Afterward, while everyone gathered downstairs for sandwiches and coffee, Daniel cornered me near the coat rack. "Dad thinks you manipulated Mom near the end," he said quietly. I stared at him. "What?" "He thinks you pressured her about the will." I actually laughed at first, because it sounded insane. But Daniel didn't laugh. "He's serious, Eleanor." The room suddenly felt tilted beneath my feet. I looked across the reception hall and saw my father watching me from beside the coffee station. No grief in his eyes. No sadness. Just suspicion. That was when I realized something horrible. He truly believed I wanted his money. Not because I'd ever asked for it, but because men like Harold Whitmore couldn't imagine anyone sacrificing years of their life for love alone. A week later, I received court papers at my apartment. My father was contesting my mother's final estate documents, and he was accusing me of fraud. I remember standing in my tiny kitchen, holding those papers while Lucy read them over my shoulder. "You didn't do this," she whispered. "Number. So fight him." I looked around our apartment, the leaking faucet, the overdue electric bill on the counter, the second-hand furniture. Fight him with what? That night, I called 3 attorneys. The cheapest wanted a $5,000 retainer. I had $311 in savings. By midnight, I sat alone at my kitchen table crying quietly so Lucy wouldn't hear me through the bedroom wall. Then I remembered something my mother used to say. When people underestimate, you don't interrupt them. The next morning, I went downtown to the Indianapolis Public Library. And that was where everything began. The Indianapolis Public Library became my second home after that. Every evening, after my shift at Grady's Diner, I'd drive downtown in my old Buick, carrying a yellow legal pad and a grocery store bag full of peanut butter crackers because I couldn't afford cafeteria food. I started reading everything I could about probate court estate disputes and financial disclosure laws. At first, none of it made sense. The legal language felt designed to confuse ordinary people like me. Sentences stretched half a page long, words I'd never heard before. Petitions, fiduciaries, codicils, summary judgments. I almost gave up after the first week. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, an older woman sitting beside me in the legal research section leaned over and said, "Honey, you're reading that backward." I blinked at her. "What?" She pointed to the highlighted pages in front of me. "You're trying to memorize the language instead of understanding the purpose." That was how I met Lorraine Donnelly. Mrs. Donnelly was 72 years old, wore orthopedic shoes with little silver buckles, and had worked as a probate paralegal in Indianapolis for nearly 40 years before retiring. Her husband had passed away 2 winters earlier, and she came to the library mostly because she hated sitting alone in her house. "You remind me of every exhausted single mother who ever walked into a legal office terrified," she told me that night. Well, I said weakly, that sounds accurate. After that, she started helping me twice a week. Not as a lawyer, just as someone who understood how the system worked. She taught me how to organize evidence, how to read financial disclosures, and most importantly, how not to panic when attorneys tried using complicated language to intimidate people. Most courtrooms, she told me one evening, run on confidence. Half the battle is refusing to look frightened. That was difficult advice considering I was frightened almost constantly. During the day, I worked double shifts at the diner because I needed every dollar. At night, I studied until my eyes burned. Some evenings, Lucy sat beside me at the kitchen table doing homework while I highlighted legal documents. You know, she said one night, Grandma would have loved this. I smiled tiredly. Loved what? You fighting back. The truth was, I didn't feel brave. I felt exhausted and angry. Not even because of the money anymore. It was the betrayal that hollowed me out. I had spent years taking care of my mother while my father and Daniel stayed comfortably distant. Yet somehow, I was the villain now. The greedy daughter. The manipulator. One afternoon at the diner, I was refilling coffee for 2 retired factory workers when one of them slid a folded newspaper toward me. I looked down and saw my father's face staring back from the business section. Harold Whitmore announces new luxury development. The article described him as a self-made family man devoted to integrity and community values. I almost laughed out loud. Everything all right? Ellie Frank asked gently. Frank had been coming into Grady's every morning for nearly 10 years. Korean War veteran, widower, always ordered wheat toast extra crisp. Yeah, I lied. He studied me carefully. You got your mama's eyes, he said quietly. And your mama never backed down from bullies either. That nearly broke me right there beside the coffee station. The strange thing about struggling publicly is how invisible your pain becomes. Customers still needed refills. Bills still arrived. Laundry still piled up. Meanwhile, my father had attorneys filing motions almost weekly. Every envelope from their office felt like another threat. Then came the settlement offer. I opened it at the kitchen table after work, while Lucy heated canned soup on the stove. The proposal was insulting. If I signed away any claim to my mother's estate and agreed not to challenge future property transfers, my father would provide a one-time family support payment of $15,000. $15,000. That was apparently the value Harold Whitmore placed on my silence. Lucy read the letter twice. He thinks you'll take it because we need money. He's probably right, I admitted softly. The rent was late again. My car needed brakes. Lucy would graduate high school soon, and I had no idea how we'd afford college applications. $15,000 could change our lives. For about 6 months. Then what? I folded the papers slowly. Number. Lucy smiled. Good. 2 days later, Daniel showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. I opened the door and nearly didn't recognize him in his tailored overcoat and expensive watch. He looked completely out of place, standing in our worn apartment hallway with its flickering overhead lights. I'm trying to help you, he said before I even invited him inside. That'd be a first. His jaw tightened. Dad's willing to settle this quietly. He accused me of fraud. He's emotional after Mom died. I stared at him in disbelief. Emotional Daniel, he's suing me. Daniel sighed heavily like I was the difficult one. You don't understand how these things work. No, I snapped. You don't understand how normal people live anymore. That hit him harder than I expected. He glanced around the apartment. The patched sofa, the tiny kitchen, Lucy's graduation photos taped beside the refrigerator. For a moment, something almost human crossed his face. Then it disappeared. Dad's attorney's bill, more in an hour than you make in a month, he said quietly. You cannot win this. I looked him directly in the eye. I already survived things harder than your father. His expression shifted slightly at that. Your father, not our father. He noticed it too. Before leaving, Daniel paused near the door. You really think Mom changed her will willingly? Yes. He hesitated. Then he asked something that stayed with me long after he left. Did she ever say why? That question haunted me because the answer was complicated. My mother hadn't left me millions. What she'd done was worse in Harold's eyes. She'd left me control. Control over several financial reviews tied to older family properties. At the time, I barely understood why that mattered. Until 3 nights later. I was sorting through another box from my mother's attic when I found an old leather ledger tucked beneath photo albums. Inside were handwritten notes, bank transfers, property numbers, and dates spanning nearly 15 years. At first, it looked meaningless. Then I noticed something strange. Large amounts of money had been transferred repeatedly between shell companies connected to my father's developments. And beside one entry written in my mother's handwriting were the words, "Harold moved this before tax review. Daniel doesn't know." My stomach tightened. I kept turning pages. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Then an envelope slipped loose from the back cover. Inside was a notarized letter addressed to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. The final line made my blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, Eleanor knows the truth." I barely slept the night I found my mother's letter. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly dawn, with the ledger spread open beside me, rereading the same pages over and over, while the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Outside our apartment window, Indianapolis was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a passing truck on the wet street. Lucy came out around 3 in the morning wearing flannel pajama pants and rubbing her eyes. "You're still awake." I nodded. She looked at the papers scattered across the table. "Bad." "I don't know yet." That was the truth. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at, but I understood enough to know my mother had been afraid. And my mother was not an easily frightened woman. Lucy poured herself a glass of water before sitting beside me quietly. "Are you scared?" I stared at the ledger. "Yes." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Good," she said softly. I looked at her in confusion. "You always tell me brave people are scared first." I laughed tiredly despite myself. That became our routine after that. I worked mornings and afternoons at the diner, then spent evenings researching financial records while Lucy studied nearby. Some nights, we ate grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight because neither of us had energy to cook properly. I started keeping notebooks full of timelines and company names connected to my father's developments. One name appeared constantly: Whitmore Urban Holdings. Another appeared even more often: Patterson Property Group. At first I assumed Patterson was just another investor. Then I learned something strange. The company technically existed, but it had no employees, no office, no real public presence at all. Mrs. Donnelly adjusted her reading glasses when I showed her the records at the library. "This," she said carefully, "looks very similar to asset shielding." I swallowed hard. Illegal. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. She tapped the ledger gently. "But hidden transfers inside an estate dispute that gets attention." My chest tightened. Could Dad go to jail? She studied me for a long moment before answering. "You still don't want to hurt him." It wasn't a question. I looked away. "No," I admitted quietly. "I just want him to stop treating me like I'm nothing." Mrs. Donnelly sighed softly. "Family lawsuits are rarely about money, Eleanor. Money's just the weapon people choose." That sentence stayed with me, because deep down, I knew she was right. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. My father wanted to erase me. If Harold Whitmore could convince the court I was dishonest, unstable, or manipulative, then he could rewrite the story of our family entirely. He could pretend I'd never sacrificed years caring for my mother. Pretend I'd never mattered at all. And the terrifying part: powerful men usually succeeded at rewriting history. A week later, I received another filing from Harold's attorneys demanding additional financial disclosures from me. I almost laughed when I read it. My finances were painfully simple. One checking account, a nearly maxed-out credit card, an old Buick worth maybe $2,000 on a good day. But that wasn't the point. They wanted humiliation. They wanted every overdue bill and financial struggle laid out publicly in court. That evening, I broke down crying in the diner freezer. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet exhaustion. I leaned against stacks of frozen fries and pie crusts, trying to catch my breath, while tears rolled down my face. Then the freezer door opened. My manager Carl stared at me for half a second before handing me a paper towel. "Take 5 minutes," he said gently. "I'm okay." "No, you ain't." Carl had owned Grady's for nearly 30 years. Thick, gray mustache. Arthritis in both knees. The kind of man who still believed employees deserved dignity. I wiped my face quickly. "Sorry." "For what?" "For being a mess." He snorted softly. "Eleanor, this diner's survived divorces, funerals, gambling addictions, and one waitress who stabbed her husband with a salad fork in 1998. You crying in the freezer barely makes the top 10. That startled a laugh out of me. Then his expression softened. "Your mama used to come in here before she got sick." I looked up. She did. Every Thursday afternoon, ordered pie and black coffee. He leaned against the freezer door. "Talked about you constantly." My throat tightened instantly. What did she say? That you were the only person she trusted when life got hard. I looked down at the floor before I started crying again. When I got home that night, there was a certified envelope taped to the apartment door. Another legal notice. But this one included something different. A formal request demanding I surrender all remaining documents belonging to my mother immediately. That scared me more than anything so far, because it meant my father knew something existed, and he was nervous. The next morning, I called the county recorder's office during my lunch break. A woman named Denise helped me locate several older property filings connected to Whitmore Urban Holdings. When she read off the transfer dates, my stomach twisted. Many transfers happened during periods when my mother was hospitalized. One transfer occurred the exact week she underwent emergency surgery. I drove straight from work to the library and spread the records across a table beside the ledger. Mrs. Donnelly went pale halfway through reading. "Oh, my lord." "What?" She pointed at 2 signatures. "These don't match." I leaned closer. My mother's signatures looked shaky and uneven on certain property authorizations. Too shaky. As if someone had guided her hand. Suddenly I remembered something chilling. 2 years earlier, during one hospital stay, my mother had whispered to me, while heavily medicated, "Don't sign anything Harold brings." At the time I thought she was confused from pain medication. Now I wasn't so sure. That night, Lucy found me sitting silently at the kitchen table, staring at old medical records. "You okay?" I shook my head slowly. "I think my father used Mom when she was sick." Lucy sat down carefully. "Then why are you looking guilty?" The question hit me harder than she intended, because part of me still felt like a terrible daughter for investigating him at all. Lucy reached across the table. "Mom, good people don't sue their own daughter after she cared for their dying wife." I closed my eyes. She was right. But children spend a lifetime wanting their parents to be better than they are, even when reality says otherwise. 3 days later, we returned to court for a preliminary hearing. Harold walked in wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Daniel followed closely behind him carrying folders. Neither of them looked at me, but Harold's attorney did. And when he saw the thick binder I carried into court, his confident smile disappeared for the first time. That was when I realized something important. They were no longer completely certain I would lose. The second hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in early March, the kind of Indianapolis morning where winter still clings stubbornly to the streets, even though the calendar promises spring. I came straight from the diner wearing black slacks, sensible shoes, and the only blazer I owned, a navy one I'd bought at a thrift store 5 years earlier for a church fundraiser. Underneath it, I still smelled faintly like coffee and bacon grease, no matter how hard I scrubbed my hands before leaving work. Across the courtroom, Harold Whitmore looked like a man stepping into a shareholders' meeting instead of a family dispute. Perfect silver tie, pressed suit, gold watch gleaming beneath the lights. Daniel sat beside him, flipping through legal folders, while their attorneys whispered confidently back and forth. For a brief moment, I almost lost my nerve. Then I remembered my mother struggling to breathe in that hospital bed, while my father complained about parking fees downstairs. And suddenly, the fear turned into something steadier. Resolve. Judge Keller entered precisely at 9 o'clock. As everyone stood, I noticed him glance briefly toward me before opening the session. The hearing began with Harold's attorneys presenting arguments about financial exploitation and undue influence. They used polished language meant to paint me as unstable and manipulative. Listening to strangers describe my life like that felt surreal. One attorney actually referred to me as financially desperate. I wanted to stand up and shout, "Of course I'm financially desperate. I'm a waitress raising a child alone in America." Instead, I stayed quiet. That was something Mrs. Donnelly drilled into me repeatedly. Never interrupt people while they're underestimating you. Then came the moment Judge Keller turned toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "you may respond." Every eye in the courtroom landed on me. I stood slowly gripping my notebook tightly enough to hurt my fingers. "Yes, Your Honor." I could practically feel Harold waiting for me to embarrass myself. So I started with the truth. "I took care of my mother for 3 years," I said. "I drove her to appointments, handled medication schedules, stayed overnight during hospital admissions, and managed her daily care while working full-time." I looked directly toward the judge. "My father and brother are welcome to dispute any part of that statement under oath." Silence. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Harold stared straight ahead. I continued carefully. "The claim that I manipulated my mother for financial gain ignores one important fact." I opened my binder. "My mother repeatedly attempted to involve my father in medical and financial decisions during her illness, and he routinely declined." One attorney stood immediately. "Objection. Unsupported characterization." Judge Keller looked at me. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes, Your Honor." My hands trembled slightly as I passed copies of hospital contact records forward. Pages and pages. Emergency call logs. Appointment contacts. Care coordination forms. All listing me. Not Harold. Not Daniel. Me. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as the judge reviewed them. Then Harold's lead attorney tried another tactic. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said smoothly, "isn't it true you stood to benefit substantially from recent estate modifications?" "Yes." He smiled faintly like he'd trapped me. "And isn't it also true you lacked the financial means to support yourself adequately?" I heard the implication clearly. Poor woman manipulates dying mother for money. My face burned, but I answered calmly. "Yes." "And yet you expect this court to believe your motives were entirely selfless." I looked directly at him. Number. That caught him off guard. "My motive," I said quietly, "was to keep my mother safe while she was vulnerable." For the first time all morning, the attorney lost his rhythm slightly. I kept going before he could recover. "She was heavily medicated during several property transfers now under dispute. I believe the court deserves to examine those transactions carefully." That changed everything. I watched Harold's expression tighten instantly. One of the attorneys leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Judge Keller adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you alleging fraudulent transfers?" "I'm requesting further review." The distinction mattered. Mrs. Donnelly had made sure I understood that. Never accuse unless you can prove, but ask questions boldly. The judge nodded slowly. Then Harold himself finally spoke. "This is ridiculous." His voice echoed sharply across the courtroom. "She's trying to destroy this family, because she's resentful of her own failures. The words hit harder than I expected. Failures. 45 years old, and somehow hearing it still hurt like I was 12 again. Judge Keller frowned slightly. "Mr. Whitmore, direct your comments appropriately." But Harold was angry now. "She's worked in a diner her entire life," he snapped. "She has no understanding of business, finance, or legal matters." I saw pity flicker across a few faces in the gallery. Then something surprising happened. Judge Keller looked directly at my father and said evenly, "Mr. Whitmore, financial understanding is not measured by income." The room fell silent again. Even Harold looked momentarily stunned. The judge continued reviewing documents quietly before asking for a short recess. The second everyone stood, Harold's attorneys surrounded him immediately. Meanwhile, I gathered my papers alone at my table. That was when I heard a soft voice behind me. "You're doing better than they expected." I turned to see a middle-aged court clerk smiling faintly. "I see these hearings every week," she said quietly. "Most people with money think confidence and competence are the same thing." Before I could respond, she walked away. Outside the courtroom, I stood near a vending machine drinking terrible coffee while trying to steady my nerves. Then Daniel approached me carefully. Not arrogantly this time. Uneasy. "What exactly did Mom give you?" he asked quietly. I stared at him. "You mean besides years of responsibility?" "Eleanor." "No. Seriously." My voice cracked slightly. "Where were you when she fell in the bathroom at 2 in the morning? Where were you during her heart episodes? Where were you when she cried because Dad treated her like an inconvenience?" Daniel looked away immediately. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he actually looked ashamed. Before he could answer, Harold stepped into the hallway. "We're leaving," he snapped toward Daniel. But as he turned, his eyes landed on the binder tucked beneath my arm. And for just a second, I saw fear. Real fear. Not anger. Not annoyance. Fear. That was when I understood something clearly. My father wasn't terrified of losing money. He was terrified of losing control. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. Toward the end of the session, Judge Keller reviewed upcoming evidence submissions and asked whether either party intended additional financial disclosures. I took a breath slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." I walked carefully toward the clerk's desk, carrying the old ledger from my mother's attic. The second Harold saw it, the color drained from his face. Because he recognized the handwriting immediately. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, Harold Whitmore looked like a man who realized his daughter might actually defeat him. The moment my father saw my mother's ledger, the entire courtroom changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was smaller than that. A shift in breathing. A tightening of shoulders. The silent realization passing between expensive attorneys that something had gone very wrong. Harold Whitmore had spent his entire life controlling rooms. But that morning in probate court control slipped from his hands for the first time. Judge Keller examined the ledger carefully, while Harold's lead attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of undocumented personal materials without proper authentication." "That can be addressed during review," the judge replied calmly. I watched Harold's jaw tighten. He knew exactly what was inside those pages. And more importantly, he knew I now had it. The hearing ended shortly afterward, but the damage had already been done. As people filed out of the courtroom, I noticed several business associates who'd attended in support of my father, whispering quietly among themselves. Doubt spreads fast around powerful men. Outside the courthouse, Indianapolis felt strangely bright after hours under fluorescent courtroom lights. I stood near the front steps, clutching my binder, while traffic rolled past on Market Street. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear anymore. From adrenaline. "You all right?" I turned and saw Mrs. Donnelly slowly approaching with her cane. "You came." Of course I came. She looked toward the courthouse doors. Judging by Harold's face, I'd say your mother just reached out from the grave and slapped him. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Then unexpectedly I started crying. Mrs. Donnelly pulled me into a hug right there on the courthouse steps, while people walked around us pretending not to stare. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered. Yes, you do. No, I really don't. She leaned back slightly and looked me directly in the eyes. Eleanor, courage is rarely confidence. Most courage looks exactly like this. Terrified people moving forward anyway. I carried those words with me afterward. Because the next few weeks became brutal. Harold's attorneys filed motion after motion, trying to delay evidence review. They demanded expert examinations of handwriting, financial specialists, additional hearings. It was clear now they were no longer trying to intimidate me into surrender. They were trying to contain damage. Meanwhile, life outside court kept moving. At Grady's Diner, customers had begun hearing rumors about the lawsuit. Indianapolis may be a city, but certain communities still behave like small towns. One morning, a woman I barely knew from church touched my arm gently while paying her bill. "We're praying for you." I smiled politely. But others weren't so kind. A man at the counter muttered loudly that family greed destroys everybody eventually. I wanted to scream that I never asked for any of this. Instead, I poured coffee and kept working. That became the strange rhythm of my life. Courtroom battles during the day. Refilling sweet tea at night. One evening after closing, Carl handed me an envelope near the register. "What's this?" "Open it at home." Inside was nearly $800 in cash. I drove back to the diner immediately. "I can't take this." Carl crossed his arms stubbornly. "You ain't." "What?" "Regular customers collected it." I stared at him speechless. "Frank started it," he explained. "Said good people shouldn't fight alone." That nearly shattered me emotionally. Because after months of being treated like nothing by my own family, kindness suddenly felt unbearable. I used part of the money to finally repair my car brakes. The rest went toward court copying fees. Meanwhile, the financial review of the ledger moved forward faster than Harold expected. And that was when the real problems started. Several transfers connected to Whitmore Urban Holdings could not be properly explained under review. Money had moved repeatedly between shell companies tied to older developments during periods when my mother was medically incapacitated. One forensic accountant described the transactions as highly irregular. Judge Keller ordered expanded disclosure. Harold exploded afterward. I saw it happen in the courthouse hallway. "This is harassment," he barked toward his attorneys. "Fix it." People turned to stare. For the first time, Harold Whitmore looked rattled publicly, and Daniel looked terrified. A week later, Daniel unexpectedly came to my apartment alone. No suit this time. No polished confidence. Just exhaustion. Lucy opened the door while I was washing dishes. "Mom," she called carefully. "Uncle Daniel's here." I dried my hands slowly before stepping into the living room. Daniel looked older suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. "What do you want?" He sat heavily on the sofa. "I need to ask you something." I stayed standing. "Okay." His eyes met mine carefully. "Did Mom ever talk to you about Patterson Property Group?" Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. "Why?" "Because I found internal files at the office." His voice lowered. "And some signatures don't make sense." There it was. The first crack. Daniel had finally started looking for himself. "She was scared near the end," I admitted quietly. Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. "You think Dad forged documents?" "I think Mom was vulnerable." He stood suddenly and paced toward the kitchen. "You don't understand what this could do." "No," I snapped. "You don't understand what he already did." Daniel stopped walking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Why didn't you ever hate him?" The question stunned me, because honestly, sometimes I did. But hatred is exhausting when mixed with love. He's still our father, I said softly. Daniel looked like he might cry for a second. But before either of us could say more, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. This is St. Vincent Hospital, a woman said quickly. Are you related to Harold Whitmore? My heart dropped instantly. Yes. There's been a medical emergency. Everything after that blurred together. Traffic lights. Rain streaking across the windshield. Daniel silently gripping the dashboard beside me. We arrived at the emergency room to find Harold unconscious, after collapsing outside his office from chest pain. The doctors suspected a stress-induced cardiac event. And despite everything, despite the lawsuit, despite the humiliation, despite the betrayal, I was still the first person to run toward him. Hours later, while machines beeped softly around us inside the dim hospital room, Harold finally opened his eyes. He looked disoriented at first. Then he saw me sitting beside the bed. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked small. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just old. Fragile. Human. His voice cracked weakly. Eleanor. I leaned forward slowly. Yes. He stared at me for several long seconds before whispering something I never expected to hear. I didn't think you'd come. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors and the distant sound of rolling carts in the hallway. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking downtown Indianapolis, while my father lay pale beneath stiff white sheets, suddenly looking far older than 72. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Daniel stood near the doorway with his arms crossed tightly, staring at the floor, like he didn't know where to place himself anymore. Then Harold cleared his throat weakly. You shouldn't be here. I almost laughed at the irony. I could say the same thing. A faint shadow of embarrassment crossed his face. The cardiologist had already explained the situation. Severe stress, elevated blood pressure, exhaustion. Nothing fatal yet, but serious enough to force Harold into reality for the first time in years. Powerful men often believe their bodies obey the same rules as their businesses. Until they don't. The nurse entered briefly to check medications before leaving us alone again. Finally, I pulled a chair closer to the bed. You need to stop fighting me. Harold looked toward the ceiling. You already think I'm a criminal. I think you hid things from Mom. She didn't understand business. The words came automatically like an old reflex. But this time, even Daniel flinched hearing them. I leaned back slowly. You still don't hear yourself, do you? Harold's jaw tightened faintly. Your mother worried constantly. She questioned every decision, every investment. Because she was afraid. She was emotional. No, I said quietly. She was trapped. That finally made him look at me. Years ago, I would have lowered my eyes immediately under that stare. Not anymore. You built an entire life around appearances, I continued softly. Big offices, charity dinners, newspaper interviews. But when Mom got sick, none of that mattered. She just needed somebody beside her. Harold looked away first. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument. Then Daniel spoke unexpectedly. Dad, did you move those properties without telling us? Harold didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. Oh my God. The truth came out slowly after that. Not through dramatic confession. Just exhaustion. Piece by piece. Years earlier, during the 2008 recession, several Whitmore developments had nearly collapsed financially. Harold secretly used large portions of my mother's inheritance to keep the company alive. Without her money, everything would have failed. But instead of admitting weakness publicly, Harold created shell companies and complicated transfers to hide how desperate things became. Including Patterson Property Group. Daniel sank into a chair, looking physically ill as the details emerged. You told me we recovered legally. We did recover. That's not what I asked. Harold closed his eyes. For the first time in my life, my father looked like a man cornered by his own choices instead of protected by them. Then he whispered something that stunned me completely. I never meant for it to reach court. I stared at him. You sued me. I thought you'd settle quietly. There it was. The real truth. He honestly believed money would make me disappear politely, just like it always had before. I shook my head slowly. You really don't understand why I fought you. Harold's voice weakened. You always hated this family. That hurt more than everything else combined. Because it was so completely wrong. Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes. I loved this family enough to stay, I whispered. That was the whole problem. The room went silent again. Even Daniel looked shaken hearing that. Hours later, after Daniel left to speak with doctors, I remained beside the hospital bed alone, while Harold drifted in and out of sleep. At one point, near midnight, he opened his eyes again. When you were little, he murmured weakly, you used to follow me around construction sites. I blinked in surprise. I barely remembered that. You wore that little red winter coat, he continued quietly. Wouldn't stop asking questions. For a moment, his voice softened into something almost unfamiliar. Memory. Regret. You were smarter than Daniel in some ways, he admitted. People liked you naturally. I didn't know what to say. Then his expression hardened again slightly. But you chose such a small life. There it was. The wound underneath everything. I sat back slowly. You know what's funny, I said quietly. I used to think working-class people embarrassed you because you became rich. Harold looked at me silently. But that's not it, is it? He said nothing. You hate poverty because you're terrified of becoming poor again. His eyes shifted instantly. And I knew I was right. For the first time, I finally understood my father clearly. Harold Whitmore grew up hungry in rural Indiana during hard years he rarely discussed. He escaped through ambition work and ruthless control. Somewhere along the way, wealth stopped being security and became identity. And my ordinary little life threatened that identity simply by existing. Because I represented the version of himself he spent decades trying to bury. You spent your whole life chasing respect from strangers, I said softly, while ignoring the people who loved you for free. Harold stared toward the dark hospital window for a very long time after that. The next morning, his attorneys arrived, looking deeply uncomfortable. I stepped outside while they spoke privately with him. About 20 minutes later, Daniel found me sitting beside a vending machine down the hall. They want settlement discussions. I nodded slowly. That bad. He sat beside me heavily. The accountants found more transfer problems. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel surprised me. I'm sorry. I turned toward him carefully. For what? For all of it. His voice cracked slightly. Mom, you, everything. That apology mattered more than I expected. Because Daniel had spent most of his life trying to become Harold. And now he finally looked exhausted by it. Back in court the following week, Harold appeared weaker physically, but calmer emotionally. For once he didn't avoid looking at me. His lead attorney formally proposed settlement negotiations before trial continuation. Judge Keller reviewed the request carefully. Then he looked directly toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, how would you like to proceed? Every person in that courtroom expected revenge. After months of humiliation, accusations, and legal warfare, they expected me to destroy him financially. Instead, I stood slowly and took a deep breath. I don't want revenge, Your Honor. Harold looked genuinely startled. I glanced toward my father briefly before continuing. I want transparency. I want honesty about what happened to my mother's estate. And I want this family to stop treating love like a business transaction. The courtroom went completely silent. Because suddenly, this case wasn't really about money anymore. It was about whether broken people could still choose something better before it was too late. The final hearing took place on a warm April morning, with sunlight pouring through the tall courthouse windows, like the kind of hopeful spring day Indiana waits all winter to see. By then, nearly everyone involved in the case looked exhausted. The attorneys spoke more quietly. The reporters who occasionally lingered outside had mostly disappeared. Even Harold seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally. The sharp edges around him had worn down after weeks of hospital visits, financial reviews, and truths nobody in our family could avoid anymore. I arrived early wearing the same navy blazer from the thrift store. Only this time, I walked into the courtroom differently. Not afraid. Not angry. Just steady. Lucy sat behind me in the gallery beside Mrs. Donnelly and Carl from the diner. Frank had come too, wearing his old veteran's cap proudly, despite the courtroom rules about hats. Seeing them there nearly overwhelmed me. Because none of them were connected by blood. Yet they had shown me more loyalty than my own family ever had. Harold and Daniel entered a few minutes later. For the first time in my life, my father approached me before court began. "Good morning, Eleanor." Simple words. But they sounded awkward, coming from him, like a man trying to speak a language he should have learned years ago. "Morning." Daniel gave me a small nod before sitting beside Harold quietly. No expensive legal performance today. No whispering strategy sessions. Just tired people carrying years of damage into one final room. Judge Keller entered promptly at 9. After reviewing the settlement disclosures and revised estate agreements, he folded his hands calmly. "Before this court finalizes resolution," he said, "Mrs. Whitmore requested an opportunity to address the court directly." My stomach tightened instantly despite all my preparation. Judge Keller looked at me kindly. "You may proceed." I stood slowly. The courtroom felt strangely quiet as I walked toward the front. For a second I saw myself the way everyone else probably did. A middle-aged diner waitress from Indianapolis, standing alone against a wealthy family. But appearances can lie. I looked toward the judge first. "Your Honor, several months ago my father publicly said I couldn't even afford a lawyer." Harold lowered his eyes immediately. At the time, I felt humiliated, I admitted. Not because he was wrong. I couldn't afford one. I was scared every single day walking into this courtroom. I glanced briefly toward Lucy. But somewhere along the way, I realized this case stopped being about inheritance. The courtroom remained perfectly still. My mother spent the last years of her life wanting this family to love each other honestly. My voice trembled slightly. Instead, we hid behind money, pride, resentment, and silence. I took a breath carefully. I don't want my father destroyed financially. That caused visible surprise across several faces, including Harold's. I want accountability, I continued. I want transparency regarding the estate transfers. I want the revised settlement honored fairly. And I want one additional condition included. Judge Keller nodded. "Go ahead." I swallowed hard. "I want a charitable caregiver assistance fund, established in my mother's name." Even the attorneys looked startled. I continued before emotion could stop me. There are thousands of people across Indiana taking care of aging parents while working jobs they can barely survive on. Most of them have no legal guidance, no financial protection, and no support. My voice cracked softly. My mother knew what that burden looked like firsthand. Judge Keller leaned back thoughtfully. "And how would this fund operate?" I had prepared for that question. With annual contributions from designated Whitmore estate holdings, I explained carefully. Focused on legal education, respite support, and medical navigation assistance for family caregivers. The courtroom stayed silent several seconds after I finished. Then something unexpected happened. Harold Whitmore slowly stood up. At first I thought he intended to object. Instead, he looked toward the judge. I agree. I turned sharply toward him in shock. Harold's voice sounded rough, but steady. My wife would have wanted that. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Harold looked toward me fully. And in front of the entire courtroom, my father finally said the words I had waited most of my life to hear. I was wrong about you. The emotion that hit me then nearly knocked the breath out of my chest. Not victory. Not revenge. Grief. Because some apologies arrived decades too late to completely heal what was broken. Still, they matter. Judge Keller finalized the settlement shortly afterward. The revised estate agreement ensured full financial transparency, lawful redistribution of disputed holdings, and establishment of the Patricia Whitmore Caregiver Fund. Then, before concluding proceedings, Judge Keller removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, this court sees many disputes involving wealth. Very few involve integrity. The room grew still again. You represented yourself with dignity under extraordinary pressure. The strongest person in a courtroom is not always the one with the most attorneys. He paused slightly. Sometimes it is the person who walks in alone and tells the truth anyway. I felt tears burn instantly behind my eyes. When the hearing officially ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Mrs. Donnelly hugged me first. I told you courage wasn't confidence. Carl shook my hand so hard it nearly hurt. Frank simply tipped his veteran's cap toward me and whispered, "Your mama would be proud." Then came the hardest part. Harold approached quietly while the courtroom emptied. For a second, neither of us knew what to say. Finally, he spoke softly. "Would you maybe come to dinner Sunday?" The question sounded painfully uncertain, coming from a man who once controlled entire boardrooms without blinking. I looked at Daniel standing nearby, then at Lucy smiling carefully behind him. And I realized something important. Reconciliation isn't forgetting pain. It's deciding pain no longer gets the final word. A few months later, life looked quieter. I still worked part-time at Grady's by choice. I started taking community college legal classes twice a week using settlement funds I never imagined having. The Caregiver Foundation began helping families throughout Indiana navigate medical and legal systems that often overwhelm ordinary people. And slowly, carefully, our family began rebuilding something more honest than what existed before. Not perfect, just real. Last week I visited my mother's grave, alone carrying fresh lilies. The spring air smelled like rain and cut grass. "I finally understand now," I whispered softly. "Not about the lawsuit. Not about the money. About worth. Some people spend their whole lives believing value comes from wealth, status, or power. But the older I get, the more I think real worth is measured differently. By who stays. By who tells the truth. By who keeps loving even after disappointment. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need the reminder that dignity doesn't come from money, and strength often grows quietly inside ordinary people. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and second chances, you're always welcome to return for another journey with us.